Okay. Hello and welcome everybody to today's meeting of City Court Council's Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Hollier. I'll be chairing the meeting this evening. You'll see members of the committee on either side of the tables, and I'm joined at this end by Bryn Roberts, the Council's Director of Governance, and Debbie Mitchell, who's the Director of Finance. Okay, if any other officers join us, if I could just ask that you introduce yourselves when you first speak, and then we'll know who everybody is. Don't think there are any apologies for absence. I think we're all here. So we'll move on then to any declarations of interest. No. So item 3 is exclusion of the press and public. So you'll obviously have read Annex 3 to 5 of agenda. Item 10 is exempt on the grounds that it contains information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person. This information is classed as exempt on paragraph 3 of Schedule 12A, section 100A of the Local Government Act. Are we all happy to take that recommendation? Yep. Okay. Move on then to minutes and action log. Any comments on the minutes? Councillor Rose?
Yeah, 3. One's just a quick clarity point. So on page 13, para 73, it says the council sets its own policies for counter fraud work about blue badges. And there's a little bit of confusion around the controlling eligibility piece. But I just wanted to clarify after chatting to a few people that the council doesn't set the eligibility, it's national eligibility. We just manage the counter fraud work against that national eligibility. So it's not a correction for the minutes because the minutes doesn't say it, but that was what was said in the meeting. So useful just to clarify that. Paragraph 74, the next one on page 13, does, I think, need a slight correction because the conversation was about borrowing. What it says here was it's about borrowing learnings from scrutiny for A&G committee level, but it was actually about A&G being part of the conversation around changes. It specifically said it needs to be considered within the review. The scrutiny review highlighted that A&G didn't have a clear non-scrutiny purpose. There was some confusion around budget, procedure, and the way in which scrutiny and A&G functions. There's a whole bit around task and finish groups, and A&G obviously has utilised those, so we probably should be doing it the same way as scrutiny in the New World Order. And so that what was said in the minutes isn't quite reflective of the conversation that happened in person, but it also doesn't appear that A&G were part of the scrutiny conversations. And I appreciate that it was yesterday that the conversations kind of concluded, but the idea of bringing back to us today what we should have learned and what we need to adapt for going into the new year, whether we have the same number of meetings, whether we have those kind of private information sessions, etc. That I think we're left in a slightly tricky spot, as I called out on Monday, that it's all gone quite late on that process. So I don't know what we can do about that. If there's any updates from an A&G perspective as chair that you can shed light on that one.
I think if we can amend the minutes to reflect what was said in the meeting. Obviously, we've got an item on the agenda, which is the outcome of the sort of self-assessment. So suggest we save any sort of discussion for there, because I think that's the point at which we can probably think as a committee of what steps we need to take to try and improve some of those issues that have been highlighted. And that's probably the point at which we can have that discussion and sort of decide amongst ourselves, really, because as you say, the scrutiny aspect of it has sort of concluded, but that doesn't mean that we can't take on some of those items and sort of decide ourselves, or
I just think
further changes.
We should have been inputting the A&G learnings into the scrutiny conversations as part of that, and it was aired before that happened. We should have had A&G as part of that conversation around which committee takes which responsibilities and have that clarity, rather than that does stuff and now we're going to try and shoehorn A&G into it. I think it's the wrong way of doing it, but I take your point. We'll have the conversation later. My last one's just a question in terms of updates. So page 14 has references to the community governance review process and the request from A&G for a report on it. Now, the report's not on the action list or the work plan, but I feel like things might have overtaken that in terms of recent events. So I guess my question is probably for Bryn more than anybody else around whether a report is the appropriate step for that. What the latest is on the CGR piece.
There is nothing to prevent us from bringing a report on the process that will be followed for a community governance review. I suppose the question becomes, given the indication from the Local Government Boundary Commission for England that they intend to review, to conduct a full electoral review of the council, whether it is feasible or possible to run the two things at the same time. I suspect the answer is no for a number of reasons, not least capacity. So we can still fulfill the requirement to bring you a report about how it happens, but not necessarily to then say, and we'll kick off.
I think probably it's the timeliness of a report. Would it'd be better to do the thing if we're doing it or not do the thing if we're not? But I think officers also said that it was the right time to do it was in conjunction with the LGBTE review when it was raised previously. But a conversation for another day. I just wanted to get your take on it. Thanks, Brent.
Yeah, and I think it would be useful to have a report, even if the outcome of that is that it's not a sensible process to do sort of concurrently. It would still, I think, be useful for A&G to have a view on what, you know, our recommendation on that is, I guess. So I think if we could take that forward in some way.
Or combine it with a report on what the LGBTE process is from a governance perspective, maybe.
Yeah, I think we did discuss that, didn't we? And we didn't, it was intended to be outside of A&G, but it's probably still useful to have a report to A&G that covers that and what the process is, so it's reported somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the local government boundary commission review information will all in due course be online through their website. I'm appreciate Councillor Rose has looked already, and it's not yet there, but the whole process will be documented on their website. And obviously, the principal decision maker here will either be council, when it comes to the question of the number of members, or beyond that, it then becomes a question of whether or not council wishes to submit a view on what the warding pattern should be, or whether council chooses to leave that to the individual political groups. I've seen examples of both.
So when you say council, obviously it's recommended to council by a body, isn't it? Are you suggesting that's the executive?
No, what I suspect will have to happen is we will have to establish a working group from council to consider the number of councillors that is considered appropriate. But it's not something that would sit within the remit of this group, because it's such a one-off piece of work. It's something that would be delegated from council.
Okay. Any further issues with the minutes? No. Go on then to the action log. If there's any issues anybody'd like to raise? Councillor Rose? No? Okay.
Just for assistance, Chair, on the action log, your members will see that I've tried to update the action log a bit more and move some actions into the completed section. I can give you a verbal update into the final item relating to recruitment of a fresh independent person. The closing date has come and gone on that, and we have had no suitable applicants. So we'll have to look at going back out and see if we can find something else.
When you say no suitable applicants, do you mean no
We had-
applicants?
No, we had an individual express interest to fulfil the role, but unfortunately they work for Newcastle Council. They live in Newcastle, so they are not eligible to undertake the role because you have to be a resident. And yes, there is a suspicion they may have had an ulterior motive for the application, so they are simply not eligible.
Councillor Rose and then Councillor.
Yeah, just for clarity on that, do you know what the reasons are? Have we not treated it as enough of a recruitment to reach as many people? Is it that people don't want to because remuneration is not sufficient? Like, do we know what the reasons are?
I think it's difficult to say why people haven't applied, is the honest answer. I mean, Mr. Binney will tell you why he applied.
Not so much why I applied, Bryn, but if it helps, it's a national issue. I met the LGA chair, Councillor Gittins, yesterday, and she flagged it as an issue nationally that there is a requirement for independent members. We might be issuing statutory guidance from the Housing Local Government Department I work for later in the year, possibly to set out the requirement for 2 independent members, but kind of the LGA is flagging that this is an issue. There are a few different complex factors. Part of it is remuneration. Some councils pay, some don't. If council doesn't pay, that's perfectly legitimate. A lot of it is skill set, apparently. There is some consideration perhaps of a national approach here where we might be able to pull together independent members across the board, and then you could have someone from a different living in a different area supporting another authority. But I think the main point here is it's a national issue and recognised by a few organisations, so it isn't specific to York, but clearly disappointing result though.
Okay, Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I understand from conversations that one of the action owners has left the authority. Do we have a mechanism in place to ensure that when that happens, that somebody else can take over as an interim to actually ensure that the action is maintained in a timely basis until somebody permanent is employed?
Yeah, sorry, I haven't updated the action. Yeah, I have allocated those actions to somebody else, so I will update the action plan accordingly, councillor. Sorry.
Thank you. I didn't think I'd catch you out.
Okay, Councillor Merritt.
Can I just check how many times we've advertised this?
Off the top of my head, I can't give you the number. I suspect that this is the second time we've advertised. But I can go away and check and get back to you on that.
Yeah.
Councillor
So if
Coles.
we advertise again and come up with the same result, we're going to have to do something different, aren't we?
My suggestion was going to be there's something different. Just whether or not there's a requirement to attend in person, and whether or not actually, if things move to hybrid meetings, that might actually encourage more people to be able to attend, particularly for an evening meeting, when actually travelling into the centre of York, if you live outside of the centre of the city, might not be the ideal scenario for quite a lot of people, but actually attending a meeting remotely might make it possible. So I don't know whether that's something that is being considered anyway, but it certainly might be worthy of consideration if it meant that we found someone.
I know the government are looking into that, aren't they? And we presumably made a
so
submission
the-
to them.
Yeah, we have indeed, yes. There's been a consultation out about whether or not we return to the ability for meetings to be hosted virtually rather than having to be in person, as almost all meetings are under the 72 Act. We've put a submission in. We'll wait to see what the approach is from central government. I would hope, given that certainly the overwhelming response that I've seen from the Local Government Association was that there was a strong desire for that ability to be given back to councils to make the choice. Do you want to hold meetings in person, or do you want to be able to hold them remotely? That government will go that direction, and that would certainly make life easier for all concerned, not just independent persons, but councillors and officers as well.
Councillor Burton.
A quick question, would that be completely remote or hybrid, or?
It would be the choice of the council.
Yes.
So we could choose to have a meeting that was set up in a hybrid way. We could choose to say, well, actually, all of these meetings will simply be remote. It would be a choice. Well,
Yeah.
that's the option that most are pushing for from central government. But we just have to wait and see what comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, any further issues to raise in the action log? No? Just in terms of the report on the Salvation Army contract, it's sort of listed now as to be reported in 2025. Is it possible to be a bit more?
If I can defer that to slightly later on, Max from Verital will give you an update on that when we get to the Verital item.
Okay. Okay, we're happy then if we're able to move on to item 5, which is public participation, but we have no members of the public registered to speak. So we can move on then to item 6, which is the Key Corporate Risks Monitor 4. And I believe Debbie's leading this with Lorraine Lunt. If you'd like to.
Yeah, I'll start because it's your usual kind of just while Lorraine makes her way to the table, it's your usual quarterly update on the key corporate risks. There are no particular changes or changes from the last one. David Walker, who's prepared this report, would normally attend the committee and present, but he's on leave, so that's why he's not here. There's just a couple of things to draw your attention to. One is that on KCR 12, we have included in the annex one of the controls is about working with the local resilience forum, and so we've just they're now publishing their local and national risks. So we've attached a copy of their risk register just for information and interest, really, so you can understand a bit more about the context of that. And the other main point for discussion today was we've done the kind of deep dive, as it were, of KCR2, which is governance, and Lorraine and Bryn, I guess, would be able to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, is there anything you'd like to add at this point, Lorraine? Any?
I can either go through the Annex C in very brief detail, or just go straight to questions, whichever chair committee wants.
I'm happy to go straight to questions if members are, if we've all read it. Yep. Councillor Coles.
Mine was really just a declaration of interest because I thought I'd seen this document before, and it was at the EPAC committee a couple of weeks ago, and I declared an interest there, and I suddenly thought I hadn't declared it here, even though I declared it at the EPAC committee. So just on the local resilience forum for York and North Yorkshire, I know it's only an appendix, but in my substantive role as the Deputy Mayor for Police, Fire and Crime, I obviously have a lot of oversight of those kind of issues day to day. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear for the record. Apologies for not making it under declarations of interest.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt.
Mine's on the general KCRs. No questions on the KCR 12 because I was at EPAT as well, and we had a very good, extensive examination of the issues.
David, would you like to? So you had a question on the general.
Yes. So we were just focusing on the Annex
go ahead.
C at the moment. Right. I just wanted to ask about two of the other KCRs. One's the local plan, which my recollection is when we discussed this previously, we were expecting to see a revised version of that KCR to address issues around the delivery of the plan, i.e. is the development, the housing and the rest of it that the plan envisages being developed, plus obviously the review that's being required by the government, which of course is another important piece of work and a big vulnerability for the council. That was one of the KCRs. The other was the one on major projects. I'm conscious that there's been significant delays to some of the major projects. So I was wondering whether the moderate net impact is really an accurate reflection of the position.
Yeah, on the local plan, we're still debating whether it needs to be a separate key corporate risk, I guess, because you're right, there are new risks now with the review and the actual delivery of, and some of that falls into other risks such as major projects. So I think we're just having a bit of a when David's back from leave and when we do the next review, I think we're going to have a look at that in a bit more detail. So that is on our list of things to look at. In terms of the major projects, there are some issues with some major projects, but not all major projects. So I'm just getting to the right. When you're talking about major projects, are you talking about the capital programme, KCR? Yeah, so the majority of the capital programme is delivering to plan and on budget. So there are some, you're right, some significant issues on some schemes. So again, I'll take that away and review that for the next review.
Okay, Councillor Fisher.
Whilst we have a local plan that's obviously reduced the risk in some areas, I now feel it's thrown up a slightly different risk, which is about the work capacity of the planning department. We've had two planning applications come in since the local plan for determination. Both were recommended for refusal, and the one we considered on I think it was Monday night was one of the worst planning applications I've ever seen. It clearly hadn't been through Thursday, was it? Yeah, it hasn't been through the pre-consultation process. The list of policies in the local plan that it breached was colossal. I said at the time I thought it was probably the worst planning application I've seen in my 15 years on a planning committee. Now what worries me is that if they're going to bung these in and say, right, here's our application, You've then got the choice of trying to negotiate after they submitted it or refusing it. And then they made it fairly clear that they were thinking that was unfair and want to go to appeal, might well go to appeal. Appeals take time, free consultation takes time. How are we satisfied we have the capacity within the planning department to deal with these large number of somewhat unsatisfactory applications? If they're good, then don't take as much officer time. But if they're shocking like the last two, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the planning department.
Yeah, I can't speak to the specifics. Obviously, I don't know the details and I'm not a planner, so I will check with Becky. That I would just remind there are directorate and other risk registers that feed up to the key corporate risks. So I would imagine that will be something that's on their directorate risk register, along with a whole host of other operational issues around resourcing. And we do have KCR 10, which is our workforce capacity risk. So again, we'll review that to make sure that if there is a specific challenge unique to one area, such as planning, that we make sure that that's the actions in here cover that and that it's on a directorate risk register.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Rose.
Yeah, I mean, to agree with that, I think the planning issues should be represented somewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean it's, as you say, its own key risk. It might be included in some of the others, or it might be just in risk registers. But the issues around Section 106 money, whether we actually can manage the affordability and some of the other things that are the kind of key parts of the local plan, some of the viability of our ability to actually enforce, like, I mean, as you say, we've only implemented it recently. We're already getting people just chucking stuff out there because it's allocated to a local plan. So, and the government can override those, the courts can override. So there's an element, I think, that should be represented somewhere on there, whatever it looks like. In terms of some of the other bits and pieces, KCR2 on governance, it says that ongoing review of the Constitution is a core part of the controls. I would say we aren't doing an ongoing review of the Constitution. I know it's BAU now, but I think, you know, it's not mentioned on the deep dive paper at all. We don't have it on any of the action logs now. It's not, there's no working group. I don't think it's a viable, tangible risk control, even if, yes, as and when there will be constitution reviews and you know, it's business as usual. I'll pick my other three off, and then if anybody wants to comment on any of them, it'll be quicker. KCR 9 on communities. There's no mention in there of the issues that we've had with some of the parish councils asking for things they can't receive without a CGR and the lack of CGR. So I think the action should include the need for CGR in due course. KCR 12 mentioned the two massive external docs being included. I think they could be included as links, perhaps, rather than in our 380 pages of papers taking up a chunk in there. But it was interesting reading, and I've got no specific points on them. And then just one point from the deep dive papers. I don't know if you want me to pick that up now or if we take that separately. But on page 77, para 30, it talks about members, equipment and accounts, the risk of using personal devices, potentially taking corporate data externally, pink papers, etc., etc. And I just wanted to ask how much of a risk there is if people choose, like, you know, we've got a risk control there that we are provided with equipment and accounts, but there must be a risk if therefore people choose not to use them. To what extent is that a risk?
Risk is that if an item is lost or stolen or misplaced, we can't remotely wipe, track and or find. We also can get into the systems to put the authentication and passwords and controls into place. And also there's the potential for information to be stored, whether it be personal data or business records, in an unsecure way. And the risk there is, it's just about putting the mitigations in place to reduce that risk as much as possible, which is why the CYC equipment and access to the systems, etc., is provided, so that council business, including personal data, is got those safeguards in place that we can reduce the risk as much as we possibly can with taking those actions.
Yeah, I guess just picking on that, and I don't want to lose the other things I mentioned, but it's only a risk control if it is followed. It is a mitigation that a lot of us choose to use the equipment that we're provided with, and we don't, you know, have any of the council data leaving corporate systems, including Outlook. But if people take pink papers home with minutes and they leave that on the bus, that's obviously a risk. But if you have an unsecure account on the web in a cloud format, or you use a weak password that can't be controlled to a strong degree by the COIC IT, that obviously is an increased exacerbated risk that we have limited ability to control. There is obviously the option for us as a council to say that data has to stay within the tenancy, that pink papers can't leave the building. Is any of that viable as an option if we did want to strengthen the controls around this risk, or is that something we just can't physically do?
It's not that you can't physically do it, it's the putting those measures up as options for approval, etc. Absolutely, you can make the measures stronger, the safeguards stronger. And also what I would remind everybody about is that when you're dealing with personal data records, that if it's a knowing breach and you've been provided with information and support and equipment, etc., and guidance and training, a knowing breach can potentially lead to a criminal offence. And I know people get concerned when I raise that as a risk to individuals, whether you be a member of staff and or a councillor, but it's a very real risk that the ICO takes very seriously. And so therefore, if measures and safeguards are provided, included training and awareness, etc., I would always put the strongest ones in place as possible. Certainly another option and a strengthened option that we can take away and discuss on improving the control measures on this.
And just for clarity, if we are using ICT that's been provided by the council and there's, and it's hacked externally, then that's not our personal responsibility and fault. But if we're choosing to do things in a completely non-recommended way against the instructions and the wishes of officers, that is a personal culpability in that situation, right?
So if on CYC networks and we are up to date with our upgrades, our patches, our firewalls, etc., absolutely, if we've mitigated our risks as much as we can, you are protected through that regime. However, on your own personal equipment, etc., and you're doing official councillor business, then it would be up to the authorities, the relevant authorities that we're investigating on what action they would take.
We had a discussion about member training yesterday at Joint Standards, and one of the things we were concerned about was improving members' knowledge of the ICT systems, how they work, use of ModGov, for example, and security. I mean, for example, I've been trying to update my register of interest and I can't find how to do it because I'm a technophobe and I tried to put an expenses claim and couldn't do that and it's now expired. So I'm useless with computers, I freely admit it, and I need training. I think there are other members who probably fall into that category as well. But the whole point about security and, getting the best out of the system safely is really important to introduce in the member training programme, especially as maybe quite a lot of new members coming in next time.
I'll certainly take that point away as another action to consider improving and or enhancing the, especially the user. I absolutely understand that user technique. Sometimes it is sitting in a room and being shown and playing until you get it. Yeah, I absolutely understand. Yeah.
Okay. And then picking up the question about the constitution review, what's its worth?
I'm happy to pick up the question about the constitution review. It may be much to the dismay of members of the Constitution Working Group, but we haven't finished. I have, I think, 7 revised drafts that are currently sitting on my computer and have been for a little while, just while I have time to get round to reconvening meetings. So I would expect that there'll be some more stuff coming out by the end of this month. It's reviewing the Constitution is very much a fits and starts process. But it will continue. That's why it's transitioned into business as usual, because it's just going to be a never-ending process.
I'll just add to that, Bryn, that obviously things like the contract procedure rules and the financial regulations are part of the Constitution. We've just had a massive change in procurement legislation, so we're reviewing our contract procedure rules. So it's not just the bit of the Constitution that you might see; it's the whole rest of it is constantly under review. So it is an ongoing. We're always reviewing it, aren't we? So.
And just to pick up on that, a lot of those sort of changes are changes you don't see because they are expressly delegated to, whether it be Debbie or myself, because it's a change in legislative background. So we are simply required to make the changes, and then we'll inform council in due course. So
Yeah, look, I totally agree with those points and take them on board. And there is obviously, I mean, we dropped an email to each other about the changes to committees that's happening, which is a change to the constitution voted through by proxy rather than going through a formal working group process. And there are obviously changes that happen all the time to the constitution. That's different to a proactive ongoing review of the constitution by a working group. I just wanted to kind of spell out that difference on there, that there is a different level of control from a group of people raising it. We've obviously dropped from our action list that we can raise any concerns and bring them. Obviously, we still can. But the fact that it's no longer in action doesn't mean that we don't bring through any concerns we have. But there's no longer that kind of A&G subcommittee that's having a look at that on a regular basis. It just reduces the level of control a little bit. That's
not the control is the ongoing review. The control is not necessarily the review by A&G. The control is as much the review by officers. That it's semantics, I think, to a certain extent, and we can look at the wording. But I would say the control is equally valid, if not stronger, from an officer perspective than it is from an elected member.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't mean A&G scrutinising more than officers. I just mean proactive rather than triggered by changes to legislation being the only reason that the constitution gets reviewed. If that makes sense.
Okay. Any further questions? Councillor Burton?
Just to be devil's advocate to Councillor Rose is dedicated to Constitution Working Group, and so am I. But I do see that if it would take a lot of time to update legislation and make that constitution relevant, then I think we can hold in abeyance our part of the working group until a time when we're ready to go on. Shall we stop there, because we could go on all evening?
Well, I think perhaps the final point I would make is all of this is reliant on officer capacity.
Yeah.
And officer capacity is at something of a premium. You know, I'm fitting this in with any one of 14 dozen other responsibilities I've got, as Debbie is. We do our best, and we will continue to do that, and we'll continue to bring things forwards. But please bear with us if there's the occasional hiatus.
Yeah, I think we as a committee, I think we'll obviously take a lead, I guess, from you as to, you know, when the appropriate time to bring things forward is. I guess in terms of the IT equipment side of things, it might be worth just circulating something to councillors just to kind of, you know, say some of what's been said in terms of the responsibility for that data. I certainly wasn't aware that my emails on my phone, and I would hate to have them on a council, you know, have to go on a council laptop. It's just not how I do things. But as far as I was concerned, that was fine. But I think it's probably a case of, you know, spelling it about a bit more, what the, you know, the potential risks or pitfalls that we might be taking by choosing to do that might be.
So just to clarify, if I'm only referring to your use for council business, you know, a lot of your work will be for residents, etc., on other issues. So, for example, if they're going through NHS, etc., I'm not saying that has to be on council stuff. But yes, I will take away and I will refresh and recirculate the guidance from ICT and both information governance on the use of CYC equipment and when it's required or best practice, safeguards, etc., for council business and that personal data and that type of records. Absolutely.
Councillor Rose?
Notwithstanding the point we just made about officer time being premium, if there's any way to also give guidance on things like people receiving casework through Facebook pages and Twitter and stuff like that, because some of that is public facing across the board, but some of it's private messaging, but you'll be accessing from multiple accounts, etc., as opposed to, I guess, a clearer cut example of using personal email versus a councillor email or similar. It'd be good if we can just get a little bit of, this is best practice in these scenarios. You shouldn't be dealing with casework and you should be referring people to email from social media, whatever it might be. Some clarity would be very useful.
I can certainly look at some proactive tips, etc., and hints for using your wider casework as well on those different contact channels that you may get approached by, because the council does it as well.
I was going to say, it might not be a huge amount of work, because actually we might already have that for LACs and community officers, etc. So.
Okay, and then I just had a question. In terms of paragraph 37 and key decisions and sort of upcoming decisions I think at the moment it's quite a limited list of things. I certainly remember in the past that it went far into the future and was a great big long list of all the sorts of decisions coming up, whereas it feels a bit more like we've got, you know, sort of immediate decisions that are sort of coming up relatively soon. I just wonder, is there a way of expanding that out a bit so we get a bit more of a kind of clarity of what the decisions are that are coming? Because it's
So I think-
difficult to get a sense of, you know, what's coming up at the moment,
Yeah.
because
It's a twofold issue. In part, there's been a lot of decisions taken in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, which means that there's sort of a gap behind the wave where there's now implementation of a lot of things happening. So we aren't getting as many executive reports through. So you'll have seen, for example, that the executive meeting for this month, I believe it was cancelled. Is that right, Robert? Yeah. Because there was no business to transact. In part, it's also back to that officer capacity about being able to plan what you're doing 3 months, 6 months, 12 months ahead. We are trying, and we will continue to do so. It's just about trying to get things on the plan as far as we can. Debbie's very good because Debbie knows her sort of financial review points, and they can go straight onto the forward plan. It's about the more ad hoc items where decisions are due to be taken, where often they are still in formulation until a certain point.
okay.
We are encouraging officers to get them on as early as we possibly can.
Councillor Merritt?
That was one of the things that was covered in the CFGS report about the forward plan, and we've discussed it at the scrutiny review working group quite extensively. And I think it's pretty clear if the new scrutiny arrangements are going to work effectively in terms of getting pre-scrutiny, we do need a minimum 6 months plan. Forward plan in terms of the items that are likely to arrive in the next 6 months. If you end up with only 2 or 3 months, then given that the new scrutiny cycles in effect once every 2 or 3 months, you won't necessarily be able to ensure that pre-scrutiny actually is possible in those sort of timescales. So a 6 months minimum advanced work plan is absolutely core to the new scrutiny arrangements working effectively.
Happy to take that back and reflect that up to CMT.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further issues or questions? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the sort of deeper dive as well. I think that was useful, and yeah, hopefully we can still, you know, see more of those, I guess, as we're going forward. And if we move on then to item 7, which is the annual report to the chair. I don't think there's anything to add, is there, apart from what's in the report? So if there are any issues or things people think we've missed and want to see reflected in it, happy to take suggestions. No?
The only observation I would make, Chair, in relation to the final paragraph, we do say the committee would like to express its thanks to outgoing independent member Mr. Jolie and councillors Mason, Melly and Whitwash for their work. Please, that doesn't mean we're not thanking the rest of the committee. It's just that they are no longer part of the committee. I just wanted that clear.
Well,
Perhaps we could change that to thank everybody who's been involved.
well, the report's coming at annual council, and we know who else is going to be dropping off A&G for the new year. I guess there might be another list of checklists. So if you want to change that sentence, I'm happy for you to, but it made sense to me.
We'll review that post annual meeting.
Okay, we move on then to item 8, which is the annual counter fraud report. I think we're going to be able to just briefly introduce ourselves, will be much appreciated, and then yeah, quick rundown of the counter fraud report.
So I'll just say a few words about the work that we've been undertaking this year. So we've been working to our agreed programme of counter fraud work. As the report sets out, we've achieved quite a lot during the year. We've exceeded our target for savings. We've completed quite a significant number of investigations, and as a result of those investigations, achieved quite a few successes. As well as the reactive work, we've also completed our usual programme of proactive work. So this is work designed to raise awareness of the fraud risks facing the council. It's helping officers to understand where those risks are most significant, and providing advice to put controls in place to mitigate those risks. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan though at this point, who will say a bit more about some of the detail of the work that the team have been doing.
Thank you, Max. So this is the annual counter fraud report, and we're talking about the work of the team over the last financial year. We're really pleased to have met our financial target again, and we're bringing money back to the council that's been lost due to fraud. We completed 103 investigations with a 48% success rate. In the report, we break down those savings into individual areas, and as you can see, we work across all directorates and all areas within the council. We also detail the number of whistleblowing reports made to the council this year. So there were 4, and they related to working relationships, code of conduct, theft, and poor procedures. We also document some of the non-investigative work that we do for the council as well, so representing the council on the national fraud stage, for example. And finally, we've created an appendix at the end of the report, which gives a bit more finer detail about the investigations and the work that we've done. I hope that's saying enough, but we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Coles?
Thank you. It's a really interesting and useful report, so thank you for it. Just a couple of questions. One was just under the key performance figures, just how important the target is versus the size or scale of the challenge. So just any sense of how target driven you are versus how big the challenge might be in terms of the scale of things that are going on. And then the second thing, which I now can't find, was also when you're making decisions about which issues to pursue versus not to pursue, what your kind of triage process is around those things. So how you assess the scale again of maybe the scale of a report or the size of the problem versus the decision to investigate. And we're not investigating, for example, someone who either has got a vexatious neighbour or might only have there might only be a small amount of issue with whatever it was. So just any comments that you have about those two things would be really helpful.
So the question about triaging and dealing with cases, I think Jonathan's probably best placed to answer that. In terms of the sort of savings target, I suppose I'd say first of all that the value of the service is not just about identifying and delivering savings back to the council. It's about prevention and deterrent. So we do a lot of work to sort of make people aware that there are, the council takes a robust view about fraud and invests in the measures to prevent and investigate it if it does occur. In terms of the actual potential value of fraud, that is really difficult to put a figure on it. There have been national surveys, but those surveys come up with quite varying amounts of the total fraud within the UK public sector and within local authorities. So I think it's it's quite difficult to put a figure on it. I think in terms of the annual target, that's something we discuss with officers each year. It's meant to be a challenging but realistic target, and you know, if we were coming under that target each year, I think we would questions would be asked. Equally, if we were exceeding it by a long way, I think you'd probably be asking whether the target was accurate or not. I think it's a reasonable target. Whether it's the right one, that's probably a question for Debbie.
Sorry, I guess the supplementary question would be, how do we, in our most similar kind of local authority areas, in terms of the scale, is that the kind of thing that, maybe it's a question for officers, but is that the kind of thing that officers would consider when setting the target? You know, in a local authority area like ours, what is a reasonable target to be setting? And I guess it's just whether or not that work happens beforehand. It's not something you want to set, as you say, in order to, you know, you don't want to define your work in that way, but equally, just what thought process officers have before they set that target as well would be helpful.
I'm going to hand it over to Bryn, who is the contract manager for Verito.
It's very much about what is the magnitude that we perceive as being the risk, and how does that compare with where it's almost the recovery that we've made the previous year, and looking at whether or not we think that's a realistic reflection of the amount of potential fraud or actual fraud that's going on here. So there will be no point in us saying, for 5 years we've recovered £200,000, so next year's target is going to be £1 million, because what that tells you is the likely level of financial risk is about 200,000 or thereabouts. So yes, we try and set a slightly stretched target, but it has to be reflective of the operation of the business.
Sorry, just in terms of public confidence in the whole process of, you know, that's the whole reason that these processes are in place, is to ensure the public have confidence in both council services, but also the kind of assurance process that the Verito are undertaking. How would we know, for example, what a similar local authority would be experiencing in terms of these kinds of levels of fraud savings? And do we undertake that on an annual basis, or would we look at whatever a similar local authority would also be achieving in terms of fraud savings as part of that process? I'm just interested in the process that determines the number.
So I'll let Max.
I might be able to help. I think it's worth noting that there's only about 50% of authorities that actually invest in counter fraud. A lot of authorities don't have any measures in place, and they suffer the cost as a result. Those councils that do invest in counter fraud, there is no set way of measuring the potential fraud or the actual fraud that's identified and recovered, and it's something we're quite frustrated about. We think there should be some national model for measuring counter fraud within local authorities, something we've been trying to raise at a national level. The way we measure it, we only identify and report actual fraud savings to the authorities. This is actual cash that comes back to the authority, so it's a real saving. You'll see other local authority counter fraud teams with much higher savings figures, and I'm afraid to say a lot of that is based on notional amounts that we don't think is a correct and proper way of measuring performance.
That's sort of a quantification of, we've prevented this much fraud by doing proactive work, which is lovely in theory until you say, well, prove it.
Okay, I've got Cass.
Thank you. The second question was about how we triage cases when they come in referrals. We get a large number of referrals from members of the public, officers, data matching exercises, and we value all of that information that's provided to us. And we look at, in detail at the information provided, and we stress test it. We look for evidence supporting allegations. We try and measure the length of fraud because you know, our service does cost the council money, and it's not going to be helpful for the council for us to spend £1,000 investigating a £50 council tax fraud. So we look at value, but we also look at the level of evidence available. Again, it's not really worth the council's time for us to investigate the impossible to prove cases. It's not going to help. So we think that we get it right. We try and investigate the highest value cases with the best evidence. We've also introduced a compliance scheme this year. We're piloting, and we're looking at the lower value cases that in the past have been failed and not investigated. And we're reaching out to the people, and we're saying, do you have something to tell us? Is there something? We're giving them a nudge to say, declare this. And it's early days, but we've had some good success, and we're not criminalizing people who do that. We're trying to take a soft approach, and I think it's paying off in terms of, you know, stopping people continuing fraud. I see too many cases where people have committed fraud for too long, and they're kind of entrenched in a situation, and the values of fraud, the value that they've taken is far beyond anything that they will ever be able to repay. So stopping those frauds at an early stage is a benefit to them, and it's a benefit to the council.
Thank you. Is that a supplementary on?
It was a supplementary in the sense that you can't just judge in how much money you reclaim, it's how much you deter. I mean, people complain about the crime figures. Imagine if we didn't have a police service. You know, the crime figures, it'd be like the Wild West with everyone shooting each other and hanging people off, you know, lynching. You know, it's part of the key to this is to deter fraud, is to publicise when you have a success. And you don't necessarily have to do everyone, but if there are people who are guilty of serious fraud, that needs to be publicised. So that, because as you say, repeat offenders who've been doing it for a long time are part of the problem. And, you know, we have to not just measure how much you get back, but how much you deter. And that is unquantifiable. But, you know, the fact that you're only just above the target probably means that a lot of people are being deterred and not actually trying it on.
Okay, Councillor Merrick.
Two questions. One's really a follow-up on Joe's. 200,000 is obviously, you know, the figure that you've been working and delivering. But do we have a view in terms of Bryn's question about, well, is there 1 million that's reasonably targetable out there or not? I mean, clearly there's no point if there isn't 1 million, but, you know, how do we know there isn't? That's my first question.
I think that's unfortunately, that's the unknown. Actually, we don't know. What we do tend to find though is if we start looking in areas, we'll uncover fraud. But it's for example, adult social care. 5-10 years ago, local authorities generally didn't think there was any fraud within adult social care. What we've shown is there are cases. There might not be many, but those cases that do take place are quite significant in terms of value. So I think we have tried in the past to sort of try and quantify the potential. And I don't know. We could try and do that again. Whether how much confidence you'd be able to place in that figure, I don't know.
Okay. My second question partly relates to Councillor Fisher's in a way about the deterrence effect. I notice your figures on parking fraud. There's three Res Park investigations. I mean, compared with the type of comment that we get on the door in our Res Park areas, that looks a very, very small number. Now, I appreciate the money recovery is trivial, but there is an issue in terms of the credibility of our services if widespread fraud is going on and we don't really seem to be tackling the issue. Now, it may be that it's the, you know, it's the same it's the same cases that get talked around the community. But it does raise questions about the balance there in terms of, yes, there isn't a lot of money to recover, but there is a credibility about the service. So I just wondered how you take that into effect.
It's a good point. I mean, the problem with, say, blue badge and residence parking type fraud is it's quite resource intensive to try and to deal with it. Certainly with blue badge, we work closely with the parking team, and we run the special action days where we actually target, we try and identify cases, and we do it that way because that's probably the most efficient way of identifying it if it's happening. But it also means we can then publicise it, and I think it's publicising the cases is the way to send the message to people out there that, you know, the council is taking this seriously.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Burton.
Okay, also on parking enforcement, because within my ward there's quite a lot of holiday lets now, and issues with parking. I've had residents contact me knowing that the houses are used solely as holiday lets, but the owners are coming back and using their residence permit. I know of a case that's been referred to you about this, so I think it's probably quite widespread, and the fact that people don't know that it's a fraud to use your residence permits for your Airbnb clients, and that it's causing quite a problem in some streets. And then also, enforcement have been called and they don't always come out. They do come out, but not always. And, when residents are calling the helpline and then the people are not coming out, that can put them off calling again. I just wondered how much checking could you do in those particular circumstances, or is that too going into the minutiae of it all?
Well, I think it is worth understanding that actual enforcement is parking's responsibility. We work with them where there's very deliberate fraud taking place. So say with blue badges, where you've got a badge that's been used by someone who is not the badge holder, or it's a fake badge, or it's whatever. That's that sort of situation where we can support the parking team to actually take action against the perpetrators.
I think it's more the Airbnb type parking fraud that I'm more interested in, to be honest, because this is becoming a bigger problem with people who are getting in touch, and I'm really concerned about it, because they're already irritated because they've got an Airbnb next door that they don't want, and then they find the street full of cars, and they're ringing the helpline, and the helpline is an outsourced. So the helpline is outsourced, so that obviously we're paying for that, I suspect. So then is the helpline contacting the enforcement officers? How do we check that? Do we keep? We can't really, I suppose.
My observation on that, Chair, would be that's very much a council issue in terms of parking.
Right.
The counter fraud team would get involved if you've got somebody who is deliberately claiming a parking permit they're not entitled to.
Yes.
And the parking team have been unsuccessful.
Right.
And it becomes financially viable to pursue them.
Yes.
So again, you come back to, if it costs us £1,000 to recover a single parking permit, I absolutely get the point about the public perception, but you can only do so many of those before the bill for recovering becomes exceptionally high. So really, it's within parking services in the first instance And it's only when something becomes so persistent and so blatant that it then
Yes.
would fall to the counter fraud
Yeah,
team.
yeah. It's a particular case where it was passed on to the fraud team, so that I know of, and they were a bit dismayed that nothing seemed to be happening. So it's a bit disheartening, and again, it's this deterrent issue. You know, once people know, say it goes in that, you know, the person has the badge, the residence parking taken away, or they're fined, which I suppose, because it is a fraud. You know, would that deter more people? It's again this use of this system as a deterrent that I was interested in, really, but not necessarily not the blue badge system, but this particular issue.
Well, we have worked with parking services on some cases,
Yeah,
and we have taken action against people for residence parking related fraud. Not lots, but we have certainly
Yeah.
we have taken action. I think probably the takeaway we can talk to parking services to see whether there's anything more we can do to provide some extra support to them,
Yeah.
because I think enforcement is the front line. They're the people out there who need to take the action.
Mhm.
It's where they are coming up against a persistent issue that they can't address, or they know that there's some activity going on which they think that probably were better placed to take action. I think we'll have that discussion with them.
Okay,
That'd be great. Thank you.
thank you. Councillor Merritt?
I think my previous comments were really very much about actually the same issue, other than go into quite the same detail as Jane, and do welcome the one that you've mentioned in the report, which I think was certain premise in the ward I represent. I think one of the key questions is the Res Park system set up, and the way that the parking wardens monitor the most effective in terms of flushing out the people who are misuse. It's a misuse of permit issue. Quite often they've legally got the permits most of the time, but they're using them for a purpose that the permit wasn't issued for. Ditto occasional residents who are shelling out visitor permits to people who haven't got a legitimate reason to visit them on a particular occasion. But as I say, the problem is undermining the credibility of the system as a whole, which is very damaging for the council's reputation. And that was the point I was making earlier. It is seen when people are paying quite substantial sums of money for the Res Park system, that it is not being in their view being effectively administered. In the general sense that this is one part of the administration of the system. So there is quite a significant issue here. I appreciate it is time consuming, but as I say, perhaps it's also about seeing if we can find ways that they can actually operate the system better and more effectively, that flushes out the abuses and can lead to quicker and easier, less burdensome ways of enforcement.
Okay, I think if you're able to talk to parking services and then perhaps report back offline about what might further be done, that might keep everybody happy. Councillor Coles, did you? No. Okay. That's Rose.
Yeah, I've got two things. One's tangential related to that, but not about parking, which is obviously we have a challenge in the city around Airbnb and around HMOs as well. I just wanted to understand whether it would be considered fraud if people were operating HMOs and Airbnbs without the appropriate business setup, licensing, regs, etc. Whether that would be considered something that could be in the scope of this work. I know there's concerns about that being a problem in York, but I've never seen a paper on it.
I think it would depend on the circumstances. I think it's probably more regulatory issue rather than a fraud issue. I mean, there will be cases, I'm sure, where people are operating HMOs or Airbnbs where there might be fraud involved. So, I mean, there have been cases of, say, council housing being used in that way, which is clearly illegal. But I don't know, Jonathan, do you know?
So in terms of parking permits, residence parking permits are for residents, people who live in the property. So if a landlord or an owner of an HMO or an Airbnb are using a residence parking permit, then they're using it incorrectly. Whether it's fraudulent really depends on their knowledge of the system and the information that they provided to the council. Are they lying? So we have looked at these cases. They are interesting to us, and we work closely with Parking for them. In terms of whether a property is a residential property or a business property, it's not a matter for ourselves or for the council to determine. It's the ratings office who determine whether a property is or isn't, and it depends on the actual usage of it. Is it being rented out all year? Is it being rented out for a portion of the year? These things make a big difference whether it should be considered as a residence or whether it is a business. I think the lack of clarity around the rules can cause these problems with parking permits to come up. And there are council parking permits for Airbnb owners to provide for their residents. They cost more money, and it could be that the owners of the Airbnbs have actually purchased them and are using them correctly, but to a member of the public, you might not always notice the difference or appreciate the difference between the type of permit that the owner of the property has.
I think parking permits is a whole thing. Some people don't understand the rules. There's complexity around it. What I'm thinking about is more a specific, well, multiple scenarios, but to pick one specific example where a landlord knowingly rents out a house to 10 students that don't pay council tax and that they don't treat as an HMO properly, and they do it knowingly. Is that fraud, or is that just not licensing their property properly? That's just an open question, because there may well be multiple properties in the city that fall into that category. And again, similar with Airbnb and other situations, but
the council has a really good team of housing standards officers. All HMOs should be registered, and where there's a doubt whether an HMO has been registered, it should be referred to that team. And if we receive that information, we would refer it to them to kind of crack down on the unlicensed HMOs that do occur within the city.
Okay, thanks. My other question was just about the whistleblowing number. I know it's only an uptick of 3, but I guess from another perspective, it's a 400% on last year, and it's the highest since COVID. I just want to understand whether you think that is, from your professional expertise, just statistical background, it just happens to be bigger this year than usual, or whether it's because we're better at encouraging people to whistleblow, or because the problems are worse. Is it just a fluke of data or not really?
I don't think you should read too much into that fluctuation. I mean, but for a council this size, having single figure reports each year seems about right. If it was starting to get into double figures, I think that's where you probably start to be a bit more concerned.
Okay, Councillor Merritt.
Yes, sorry, Chair, I said one or two things that I should have said alleged. I do apologise. Sloppy speaking.
I'm sure that can be edited in later.
You have qualified privilege, Councillor.
Okay, I can't see any further questions, so
The only thing I did want to just say at the end is I genuinely thought this was a really, really good report. It was both concise and really clear. So just to thank you for the report, because actually we get a lot of very wordy and very long reports. This was actually quite concise and told, from my point of view, told me exactly what I needed to know. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we can move on then to item 9, which is the review of effectiveness of the A&G committee. Is there anything you'd want to say that's beyond what's written down already, or?
No, I don't think so, Chair. I think hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory.
Okay.
If I may, Chair, I think this was brought as a paper just so that it was then placed on the record. It was obviously referred to at the last meeting, and it was just so that it's then placed there for public examination.
Okay, so we're just asked to note the results, then consider if there are any changes required. Councillor Rose.
Yeah, just a few quick things. You know, I mentioned last meeting that the score is roughly 3.3 out of 5 versus 2.1 out of 5 for scrutiny. So it shows we don't need as much review as that, but it still shows room for improvement. And I think actually now that the public can refer to what we're talking about in the meeting, questions 6 and 7 on page 321, they show honesty in us critiquing our own skills and knowledge, which I think is a sign of these being fairly accurate responses. Question 11 is a concern on page 322 of our impact on decision making. Question 22 and 23 aren't great responses or results on page 326, sorry, around our relationship with leadership and exec. So I think there's definitely some significant room for improvement in a couple of those areas. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that we ensure we have better training on the exact purpose and distinction of A&G from scrutinies, which I mentioned in the scrutiny review piece, alongside obviously the work going on with scrutinies and working groups, etc. But also there's that clear gap throughout this set of results around bridging the gap between A&G and management and exec. And I think there's a piece of work to be done in that space, whatever that piece of work is, that I think we should consider, if not now, then another time.
Okay, I think I would certainly see these as a sort of starting point for what action, if any, is needed in each of those sections to improve, you know, and to sort of raise us up the sort of ladder. And there are some sort of slightly odd questions, like do we meet with the external auditor sort of once a year, and then it's sort of always, mostly, and occasionally. And we've kind of split 3 ways when that's a sort of factual question of whether or not we did. So I think there's perhaps some of the questions could be tweaked to be a bit more, you know, make a bit more sense, I guess, because obviously we did meet the external auditor, but we've all gone completely separate ways on always, mostly, and occasionally. So I think there's to work, perhaps maybe it's something to do kind of in sort of informal meeting or something where we perhaps look at some of these issues for people that are interested and sort of think if there are things that we can do to sort of raise us up the list. And I guess some of the particular things are, you know, about trying to be a bit more strategic and looking a bit more over the, you know, over the area rather than getting too bogged down in the sort of minutiae. I think some of the things we've started, like the sort of deep dive into the risk, that was sort of answering some of these sort of issues about that sort of issue. So I think what I'd suggest is maybe some sort of informal meeting where we perhaps look at some of these and whether or not there are things we could sort of do as a committee or things we should do more of, or some things we perhaps should do less of. So I'll suggest that, and if there are any views. If not, Councillor Rose.
I think that would be very sensible. And again, post-annual counts, there may be different people who haven't experienced stuff in the past. So getting that input in an informal setting about what we can improve would be good. I think it would be good to have a specific proposal from us that we have better training on A&G and new scrutinies and the role of the committees within the next, 3-6 months, as opposed to waiting until after the next locals. I think that's a specific recommendation. We don't need a working group chat for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's always one of the issues when you're on a sort of 4-year cycle. You get a new influx of people onto committee after the election. It takes them a year to know what's going on. It takes them a year to get to the point where they sort of know what they think needs changing. Then takes another year to sort of make those changes, by which point you're like, oh, well, there's no point now. There's an election in a year. And then it's sort of the whole cycle starts again. So I guess it's making sure that those things are perhaps embedded a bit before we get to the next election, and there's a, potentially a whole new committee of people sort of starting from scratch again. So, yeah, so I think if we could perhaps set up a meeting at some point and perhaps just go through and see if there are any, you know, best practice elsewhere or something that we could sort of take on board. That would be useful. Other than that, happy to move on. Okay, next item is the Audit and Governance Work Plan. I've lost. Okay, is there anything to?
I don't think there's anything to add. I think, as I said, there may be a need for an additional meeting in June. But I'm still working on that, and as soon as I know, then obviously we'll confirm that with members. Beyond that, you'll see that the next meeting after this is the 30th of July. That's very much a finance focused meeting. So it will be very much Debbie and the finance team in the driving seat. Then 3rd of September, we're into back external audit, risk and finance. If things come along as they do, then obviously we'll add to the plan as necessary. And I'm conscious that as part of the next item, Max will doubtless give an update about the review of contracts, which will need to be slotted into this as an early opportunity.
Okay. The only thing I was going to mention is, having seen the work plan we have on the North Yorkshire A and G, I think there might be some advantages of looking at that, because it's a way of listing everything we should be doing, and then when it's coming, and so you get a sense of perhaps what you're missing. And I think this is sort of the other way around, which is a list of everything, a list of when things are, and then what's coming then. And I think there'd be an advantage in looking at the way they do it, because it means you don't sort of miss things. Because when you look at this, obviously it's a great big long list of things, but you don't necessarily see what isn't here that perhaps should be. Or, you know, when things are coming that are perhaps a little bit further into the future. So I think
we can
the way
take
that's,
that,
yeah, I think it'd just be worth having a look at that and seeing if there's some advantage to sort of slightly twisting around the sort of way we present it.
Yeah, so we'll take that away. We'll have a look at that. Always happy to learn from other practice.
But any other issues? No. Okay. So I think the next item is item 11, but what we haven't done is item 12, urgent business. I know it's not sort of technically urgent business, but there are the changes to the committees that I think it would be useful to give an airing to.
Yep, by all means, Chair. So I circulated earlier to members a note about the changes that are being published as we speak, as I understand, for committee places for council. In essence, there's an element of going back to where things were and an element of tidying. So I understand that Staffing Matters and Urgency has been essentially a committee of all sizes in the last five or so years. It's been everything from a 3-person to a 7-person committee. The intention with this is we're going back to a 3-person committee with a quorum of 2. What that means is that if there's a need to arrange ad hoc meetings, it becomes much easier to get the necessary quorum of people involved. And then in terms of the appeals panels, the council has presently 3 appeals panels: corporate appeals, education appeals and housing appeals. 2 of those panels have not met in 2 years. The 3rd one has met 11 times since 2022. So the intention is to simply have a combined panel. It will run on the basis of 5 members being appointed to it. Any hearing that then needs to be convened will be dealt with by a subcommittee of 3, so it will be very much like a licensing sub. There is no restriction on substitutes for that committee. So if someone has particular expertise on that in a subject, so let's say we remarkably have a housing appeal comes in, and I use that, as I say, we haven't had one of those since, well, the earliest record I looked at there was January 22 was the last meeting scheduled and cancelled. If we have a member who's particularly interested and invested in housing, there is nothing to prevent them from being substituted onto the committee in order to sit. It's not like licensing where you have to be trained in something before you can sit. So it's really just trying to streamline things a little bit. It takes some meetings out of the diary. Both of those committees will then meet quarterly as a standing commitment. Then it means that we're no longer scheduling meetings that we're going to cancel because we know that there's virtually no business. So it's just a degree of tidying, that will then feed into other changes that are happening through executive. So the executive member decision sessions will be changing their frequency, which means that the calendar will hopefully be a little less crammed for everybody. And there'll be some clear water around meetings.
Okay. Is there any questions, issues anybody wants to raise? No, I think as we've said, it's more just to be aware of, because obviously it's presumably already been published.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so that's the only item of urgent business. I'll just note that because I know there's a exempt part of the next item where we'll presumably go into private session. But if we could move on then to item 11, which is the annual report of the head of internal audit. And I guess if we proceed as far as we can in public and then.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So Colin Munro, Assistant Director, Audit Assurance. So this report here presents the annual outcome from the work that we performed in 2024-25. Its main purpose is to present to members our Head of Internal Audit annual opinion, which is given on the strength of the Council's control environment, so its risk management, governance and internal control arrangements. It also provides members with outcomes from Verito's quality assurance and development arrangements, which we maintain to ensure that we conform to professional standards in delivering our work. In an untypical part of the report, we do have our draft internal audit charter appendix 2. We do review the charter every year, but it's fairly static document setting out sort of the governance and delivery arrangements for internal audit. Changes to the internal audit standards regime have required us to review the charter in more detail. We have made, as a result of that, some minor changes. None of them are going to impact on the way that the service is governed or delivered. But in order for the committee to be able to fulfil its terms of reference in relation to internal audit, we're presenting this for approval. Much of the report will actually look familiar to yourselves from progress reports we presented earlier and over the course of the year. I don't plan on spending any time on the completed and in progress work, which is captured in the appendices within. I'm happy to take questions on those naturally, but except to highlight what we have by way of commentary in paragraphs 10 to 13 on the contract management audit. I note that came up earlier. The Salvation Army contract is included in the scope of that work. At the March meeting of the committee, we provided a verbal update that we had to restart the work as a result of the council's work in implementing the new procurement legislation. We've since been able to restart that work, and our intention, it says in this report here, as we were waiting for the revised work programme, was to report to the September committee. Our timeline for delivery is currently showing 15th of August for final report. If we can try and speed that up to meet the now 30th of July meeting, we will do that. If we can't, then we'll at least present some findings as we have them in time for that meeting. So the key part of the report is the annual opinion itself, and that's given in paragraph 25, page 344 of your packs. And that's to say that we've reached a reasonable assurance opinion. We haven't placed any reliance on other assurance providers in giving that opinion. That's purely on the body of work that we've undertaken during the year. And it's our view that there aren't any significant control weaknesses that we would recommend for inclusion in the council's annual governance statement. So in summary, that's the content of the report, but happy to take any comments or questions from the committee.
Okay, are there any questions or comments? Not, are we happy to approve the draft internal Audit Charter? Yep, okay. So if there's no questions at that point, I think if we go into private session and look at the exempt part of the report, okay, Councillor Rose?
I guess just one quick comment before we close, that it's, you know, one of the things that we do in ANG at a very high level is try and get assurance around quality of governance, and so that statement of no significant concerns and that there's nothing for inclusion in the annual governance statement is a good summary of where we're at, considering we've just said the extent to which we think we can improve ANG. Actual governance in the council is at a high standard from you know, a pseudo independent assessment, if you like. So,
Okay.
and thank you again for the report. Again, very well written, thorough, concise, and does the job. So I appreciate it.